left off was the end of that slide. So this is this is section 07, World War II, part 2. Hoorah! So Blitzkrieg, just translated in English, is lightning war. And one could argue that this was one of Germany's most successful methods of winning a battle, not of winning the whole war, but just a battle. And this was very, very different than it was in World War I, where people were in trenches and you just sat there for days, if not weeks on end, trying to shoot each other. The basis of Blitzkrieg was to have forces, all of them, that were very mobile. You needed tanks that could move, you needed trucks that could haul men around, infantry, and you needed airplanes. And you needed everything to be able to move all your people, all your weapons, all your ammunition, all your food, all your stuff. You needed to be able to move very fast, because the point was to overwhelm the enemy before they could regroup and figure out what to do and then send more people and weapons in there. You didn't, instead of having a big giant battlefront that was hundreds and hundreds of miles long, you concentrated all of your power or all of your weapons in a small area, like maybe only 5 or 10 or 20 miles across. So that means instead of spreading out your tanks one every mile, you've got one every 100 yards. Instead of spreading out your infantry one human every 10 feet, you've got one human every single foot. Instead of spreading out all your airplanes to attack one airplane for every 5 or 10 miles, you could have one airplane for every mile or every half of a mile. So it worked really great by concentrating your firepower. Like I said, it's not like warfare was done in World War I, where people in trenches, you reach up, you shoot a bullet, stick your head down, and try to shoot the enemy wherever they are. One of the things, a characteristic of Blitzkrieg, is that you're moving while you are attacking, whether you're in a tank or an infantryman or an airplane. And one thing about this Blitzkrieg system that the German military came up with was that air power was an integral part. The plan was, and I won't go so far as to say it wouldn't have worked without the air power, but it certainly worked way, way better to not just have fast-moving tanks and troops moving fast, but also having airplanes. Here is a picture of, that's a boatload of tanks. And look in the distance, it's more tanks. Lots and lots of tanks. This is a Stuka dive bomber. I'm not going to specifically ask you about Stukas, but Stukas, if somebody says the invasion of Poland, that's what always comes to mind, because this was the first time where Germany used this aircraft in bombing. I think it's interesting because the landing gear is not retractable. That means it saves the weight of the retraction mechanism and can carry bigger bombs. And this airplane aimed by pushing the nose down, not straight down, but extremely steep, as in 45 degrees or more. And the aiming mechanism was just a circle out there on the front of the windshield. And when they got as close as they could, close to the ground, but just enough time to pull up, they would drop the bomb and then pull up. So since they were close to the target, they were reasonably accurate without having to have a complicated aiming mechanism. And this thing was relatively inexpensive. There's a gunner, it's hard to see, but there's actually somebody in the back seat with a machine gun in the back for defensive purposes. But they built lots and lots and lots of them, and you put one big fat bomb underneath the airplane. It didn't have a bomb bay. This doesn't show a picture of a bomb. But you could get a lot of these into the air. You could build them relatively inexpensive, and you could launch, hundreds of them at once. All right, so what were Germany's military aviation? Of course, this is an aviation history class, so we're really trying to concentrate on what happened in World War II as far as aviation is concerned. And the advantages that Germany had over Europe are more than one. I think I might have mentioned this on a previous day. Germany spent most of the 1930s where the government was funding contracts with aircraft manufacturers to build airplanes that were faster and had longer range. and could carry more weapons and were more accurate and could carry bigger weapons. Let's see. Higher, fly higher. There we go. So they were improving airplanes all the time. So somebody'd come out with a new design, and everybody'd go, yay, that's great. And then somebody'd figure out something new. They'd build another one that was better than the last one, and then another one that was better than the last one, and another one that was better than the last one. And the country of Germany was spending a lot of money doing this, inventing better and better flying machines. They also spent a lot of money building large numbers of airplanes. They spent a lot of time, and they were doing this in the 1930s, before 1939, before 1941. They could build a lot of aircraft, and they did end up with a whole lot of aircraft. And they had tons and tons of different kinds of airplanes. They had airplanes like that Stuka dive bomber, so that was really good at close air support. You could drop a bomb really close to your own men on the ground, because you could be really accurate with them, because you could look down there and see where the good guys were, because they had your tanks, and the bad guys they had the other people's tanks, and you could drop bombs and be really close to the front lines. If you want to see a really good movie about the introduction of close air support in the United States Marines, you need to watch a movie called The Flying Leathernecks, starring John Wayne. And I think Robert Ryan was the co-star. Case, it's a movie about the beginning of close air support by the United States Marine Corps in World War II in the Pacific Theater of Operations. Different types of aircraft. So they built bombers, and they built fighters, and they built reconnaissance airplanes, and they built cargo airplanes, and then they built a better bomber, and a better fighter, and a better reconnaissance airplane. So they had very specialized airplanes, so each one was really, really good at doing that thing. Wow. So I'm not going to ask you on the list what kind of aircraft did they have, but those are the major kinds. I guess I said reconnaissance. Did I say transport or cargo planes? Maybe I didn't. Lots of different airplanes and lots of them. So here's a picture of a Junkers. That's about the equivalent of a DC-3, a nice cargo plane. There's a mid-sized bomber at the moment. I can't remember. I'm pretty sure this is a high. This is a medium bomber. For them, it was a medium bomber. Here's a fighter plane, and I'm always having trouble mixing up the Messerschmitts and the Focke-Wulfs. And at the moment, I couldn't tell you which one this is. But it's a fighter plane. You notice on the back tail, it says D-FWME. So in Germany... In Germany, they don't say that they live in Germany. They say that they live in Deutschland. So at the end, they got D. They got the letter D for their N numbers. All the airplanes in Germany start with the letter D. Okay. The reason I'm bringing up the Battle of Britain is, one, it was early in the war, and the Battle of Britain was fought pretty much entirely it was an aviation battle. And didn't have very much. Effectively, the Battle of Britain was German bombers flying across. It was after they took over France. This was Germany flying bombers across the English Channel and dropping bombs on Great Britain. And it was Great Britain launching fighter planes to try to shoot down the bombers. Not that they didn't have anti-aircraft guns on the ground, but most of the bombers shot down were with British fighter planes. July, August, September, October. So we're talking about this 4-month period. I mean, a year and 4 months. So Poland got invaded in 1939. A big chunk of the rest of Europe got invaded within a year or two after that. And Great Britain declared war on Germany at some point during that time. And Germany said, well, fine. We're going to take over Great Britain. We took over most of the rest of Europe. I guess Germany had not taken over Italy. Germany just had a treaty with the Italian government. Benito Mussolini, a fascist, he had a fascist dictatorship. What's the difference between being a fascist and being a dictator? I think fascism is a type of government, and dictatorship is who's in charge of that kind of a government. But most fascist governments are run by dictators. But that's a whole other discussion. I don't believe that Spain or Portugal were invaded during World War II. Does anybody know? I don't think so either. Okay. In any case, so the Battle of Britain went on for about a year and 4 months. It was the first battle ever on the planet where most of it was done, the combatants were flying airplanes. There weren't any tanks involved. There weren't any ground troops involved. There weren't any ships involved. It wasn't a naval battle. It wasn't a ground battle. It wasn't a mechanized tank battle. It was an airplane-to-airplane battle. Fortunately, if you lived in Great Britain, the British won. There's a speech, famous speech by Winston Churchill, and he said, and just so you know this speech out there, okay. You got to understand that the bombers had machine guns on them. So if you got too close to the bombers, their machine guns would shoot down the fighter planes. And the best way to shoot down a bomber was to get right behind it, because you can have a long time to be able to shoot your machine guns. So guess where the Germans put gunners? On the sides of the airplane, but they also put one in the tail. So the best place for you as a fighter pilot to shoot down a bomber was to get behind the bomber, but that's where they put a person with a machine gun, so it was also the best place for them to shoot you down. So this was very dangerous work. When I say dangerous, I don't have the numbers, but a lot of fighter planes got shot down by the bombers while the fighters were trying to shoot down the bombers. So there's a famous speech by Winston Churchill, and then he was talking about the Battle of Britain, and he was talking about the air crew. He was talking about the people that were flying the fighter planes in Great Britain, and a lot of them died. And he said, shucks, I guess I need to quote him, but never has been so much owed by so many to so few. The whole country owed the fact that Germany did not blow up Great Britain to these fighter pilots. And there's 3 or 4 movies about the Battle of Britain, and I haven't seen any of them, so I can't. And John Wayne is not in any of them. All right. So the fact that they couldn't bomb the snot out of Great Britain, I mean, they were trying. They were bombing it a lot. They couldn't win the air war, so they ended up not, at least by 1942, October of 42, they were not able to invade Great Britain. Which if they had lost, let's say Great Britain had lost the Battle of Britain, this air war, this air battle, and Germany could have invaded Great Britain, it's possible that by the time the U.S. forces got over to Europe, it would have been too late, and Germany would have had Great Britain. And what if the United States, think about the United States trying to win the World War II in Europe. What if Great Britain wasn't there? We couldn't send ships there. We couldn't send airplanes there. We couldn't do anything out of Great Britain. Where would we have done it out of? So it's possible that if Great Britain had lost the Battle of Britain, they'd have lost Great Britain, and then the World War II in Europe would have been over, and most of Europe would have been under the control of Germany. Alternate universe. So there's a picture. If you look at the little red squares, that's the bases where fighter planes were stationed in Great Britain, and all the black swastikas in France and Belgium were the bases where the bombers were taken off out of mainland Europe. There's the quote, "Never was so much owed by so many to so few." And they're all smiling because they did not die. I'm guessing. I don't know where that picture came from. All right. The Blitz was a different battle later in the war where Germany was trying to bomb Great Britain, and they started with the airfields. Of course, that's always great. You knock out the airfields, nobody can launch airplanes. They also bombed ports where the ships would come into the country or leave the country. And they also bombed factories. Or I guess when I say industry would be like factories and train yards. And I don't know what else it would be. And of course, it's was very famous that Germany was bombing civilian targets in Great Britain. But if you turn around and look to see what Great Britain and the United States did later in the war, the United States and Great Britain bombed cities in Germany. Has anybody ever heard of a city in Germany called Dresden with a D? Well, the United States and Great Britain firebombed it. When I say firebombed it, they dropped bombs that didn't explode. They were just things that burned a lot. We killed more people in the city of Dresden during World War II by the Allied forces than the number of people that died in Hiroshima 2 years later at the end of World War II. And the U.S. did that. We firebombed Tokyo. Anybody ever heard of Tokyo? It's a very large city. It's in Japan. That was a target during World War II. The United States killed more civilians with incendiary bombs bombing Tokyo than we did in Hiroshima or Nagasaki. I'm not saying that's good. I'm not trying to say that was good. I'm just trying to, who said that? Those who do not remember history are doomed to repeat it? Who said that? Question? You can use the bathroom as long as I can give out test answers while you're gone. Is that okay with you? Sure. Okay. So here's a picture of some airplanes dropping bombs. Well, at least I see clouds. I don't see any bombs at the moment. Oh, here's some aftermath of bombs. London really got pounded. And I'm understating that. London was it was the biggest city in Great Britain. A lot of things were going on in London, and the German Air Force dropped bombs and dropped bombs and dropped bombs, and we'll get to it later, but they also launched missiles and rockets. All right. Operation Barbarossa is where Germany attempted to invade Russia, and for a while it went pretty well. They got into quite a ways into Russia. After Germany realized it wasn't going to be able to invade Great Britain, it decided to invade Russia. And the Germans named it Operation Barbarossa. And they did, in fact, attempt to and go into the USSR. What the United States had been doing across the war, even before Pearl Harbor, when the United States entered the war, and then certainly after it, we were selling or leasing tanks, trucks, airplanes, and ships, not just to Great Britain, but to Russia as well. So a lot of the airplanes that were used by Russian soldiers during World War II were actually built in the United States, disassembled, shipped to Russia, reassembled, and used there. And I'm not going to ask you how many airplanes came from Great Britain or how many airplanes came from the United States. So in June 41, you notice up there, June, July, August, September, October, November, December. That's 6 months before Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor occurred in December of 41. So we were already selling airplanes to the Soviet Union before World War I, before the United States entered World War I. So you can see the far dotted line over here effectively, and I'm not going to go into lots of details here about Operation Barbarossa. Whoops, that's not what I wanted to do. But this dotted line right over here, this is about how far Germany got. So the Battle of Stalingrad is in here somewhere, and there was a Battle of Leningrad, and they, with leaving out most of the details, to defend the city, every human in those cities defended the city. So many, if not most, of the civilian population of Stalingrad and Leningrad died. Oh, there's Stalingrad, way down here. Maybe I'm just thinking about Leningrad. So I'm not going to ask you All you need to know about Barbarossa off of this slide is that the Germans got a pretty good way into Russia before the Russians could stop them. Although you could find it interesting that, look at that, look at all these countries they had already taken over. Which during the war, the Russians went back in the other direction, and all of these countries became part of the communist bloc. But that's a story of another day. The Bismarck was a German battleship. They built 2 giant battleships that were the same size, and at the moment, the sister ship to the Bismarck, the name of it is eluding me. But it was the biggest battleship. These 2 battleships were the biggest German battleships. They were the biggest battleships, period, at that time. And what's significant about this is that the battleship Bismarck was destroyed because of Navy airplanes attacking the Bismarck and launching torpedoes against it, dropping the torpedo in the water just before it got to the airplane, and then the torpedo would hit the battleship. Up until this time, many people in the navies across the world thought that the battleship was the most awesome naval ship, and that it was almost impossible to sink a battleship except for another battleship. So this was the first time that a battleship got destroyed on the planet by anything other than another battleship. And who did it? Some people in airplanes. So you don't have to worry about all these other details. So there is a picture. It was a very large ship. It was a very large ship. And here is a torpedo bomber. You can see the torpedo underneath the airplane. Biplanes, 1940, whenever it was. And the Great Britain was flying biplanes off of aircraft carriers. Oh, wait, it worked. Interestingly enough, how many aircraft carriers did Germany have? None. Germany didn't have any aircraft carriers. Now, they had a lot of submarines. A whole lot of submarines. There's some really good World War II submarine movies out there. But they didn't have any aircraft carriers. So maybe that was okay to have a nice, slow biplane. Because if you're out in the middle of the ocean, there's not too many people can launch up there and try to shoot you down. And there's a picture where the torpedo hit next to the rudder, and the rudder got stuck. And the Bismarck, it couldn't turn. Literally, the ship couldn't turn. So it couldn't go anywhere. So then they ended up moving in and destroying it. All right. So this next section, I want to talk about what was going on in the United States prior to the United States entering the war. What was going on in the U.S. before the war? The public in the United States really did not want to enter a world war. However, when Germany invaded France and then attempted to invade Great Britain, public in the United States started changing. It's not that anybody wanted to enter a war, but people started realizing that it was getting really bad, and allies of the United States were not just being invaded and taken over, I guess were being invaded and taken over. In 1940, the U.S. budget allotted an increase in military spending that was 5 times more than it did in 1939. So they went from one year to the next, and the amount of money spent on the U.S. military went up by a factor of 5. So instead of $10 gazillion, it was $50 gazillion. And you can quote me on the gazillion part there if you want to. Does anybody need me to spell gazillion? It's the amount of money that it would take to make Godzilla happy. Okay, you don't have to chuckle, but thank you. All right. The Lend-Lease Act in March 1944 was an agreement so the United States would lend or lease military equipment to mostly Russia and Great Britain. but also to China and some to France. The French, some of the French Navy actually got away when Germany took over France. All of the Navy was not in France, so they ended up going to port in Great Britain. But we sold a lot of stuff, or lent a lot of stuff to Great Britain and to the Soviet Union, USSR, the United Soviet Socialist Republic. Has anybody ever heard of that Beatles song, Back in the U.S., Back in the U.S., Back in the USSR? That's the Soviet Union, USSR. It dissolved in the early 1990s. Russia gave up some of the countries. Now it's been trying to get some of them back. Oh, that's another discussion. If you want to see a great movie, actually it's not that great. It's pretty cheesy. It's called Flying Tigers. It's got John Wayne. It's another movie that John Wayne was in when he was a pilot. And it's called Flying Tigers. If somebody sends me an email or a text this evening, I'll bring it in and I'll loan you the movie. If you didn't like 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, you probably won't like it. It's even cheesier than that movie. But it's about U.S. pilots flying airplanes in China, and the airplanes were lended or leased to China, but they didn't have any trained pilots, so some U.S. volunteers went over there. So the United States is figuring out, you know what, we're probably going to end up in this war. So obviously spending 5 times more on a military budget is proof of that. And we started ramping up by building airports across the United States, a lot of airports. And we pumped a lot of money into our air traffic control system based on the fact that when we entered the war, we'd be flying a lot more airplanes around the United States. So we'd need more airports, and we would need more air traffic control. So this is before, so we knew it was coming. It was really more of a matter of when. So one of the things that I have some personal interest in is the perspective of the country of Japan going into World War II. When I was a kid, one of my best friends, Harvey Erie, his parents were both first-generation immigrants to the United States from Japan. The high school that I went to, Reedley High School, when I graduated from high school, 18% of the graduating class were Japanese Americans. And pretty much most of the kids I went to in high school who were Japanese, their parents were kids in intern camps in the United States during World War II. And you could take a whole, hours and hours and talk about the internment of U.S. citizens of Japanese ancestry who were effectively arrested and put into prison without a trial in violation of the United States Constitution. But I'm not going to go into that right now. What I do want to go into right now is that decade, and especially the last year or so prior to, it boils down to the country of Japan felt that it was justified attacking Pearl Harbor. Like the equivalent. Punch you in the nose, so you will mean that I'm serious. Leave me alone. So, the country of Japan felt that it was the country's divine right to have an emperor and to have a control over a big chunk of the planet, effectively a big chunks of Asia. And if you look back at the United States in the 1800s, you could argue the United States had the same perspective on the western half of the continent. We took over the western half of the continent either by buying it or winning it in a war or killing the people that already lived there. One of the problems with the island nation of Japan is that they didn't have iron mines and they didn't have oil reserves. They didn't have petroleum they could drill out of the ground. So in order for Japan not to just enter the 20th century, but to compete with the other industrialized nations of the world, they needed other places where they could get steel, iron that is, and oil. And buying oil from other countries, they invaded those countries. Can anybody think of a country you know of that has invaded another country partially, so pumps a lot of oil in the United States. The United States buys a lot of it, and we invaded that country. It's called the country of Iraq. In any case, not invade that country so we could have oil. I could have sworn we invaded it because there were weapons of mass destruction, and we had to save the planet from those weapons of mass destruction, I think. You know, the ones that weren't really there. But that's a whole other topic. In any case, so Japan wanted those natural resources. In fact, in order to maintain its economy and to continue to grow and keep up with the other industrialized nations of the planet, it needed things like steel and oil. In 1940, a treaty, the Tripartite Act of 1940, effectively Japan and Italy and Germany said, we're not going to mess with each other. So effectively, Germany and Japan said, you can have your side of the world, we're going to have our side of the world. And we're not going to get in each other's business, and you can do whatever you want. We won't attack each other. Japan had already invaded in the 1930s. And for instance, Manchuria, which back in the 1930s was not part of China, it was actually a separate country. Japan invaded Manchuria because there was a lot of tin. In fact, I think even now 30% of the world's tin comes from that area of China. And China and Japan took over a lot of other countries, including Vietnam and Malaysia and Indonesia and a lot of other places to be able to get all those natural resources. Now, the United States, of course, said, shame on you, and we're going to have sanctions against you. And in 1938, the United States cancels a treaty we had with Japan, and that severely limits what Japan could do in goods. In fact, I don't have it on this list here, but the United States actually went so far as to say, you know what, we will not allow people from Japan to immigrate into the United States. So we were really upsetting Japan. Now, obviously, the United States felt that it was justified to do these things. And then in July of 1941, we stepped up the sanctions and said, you know what, Japan, you're behaving so badly in Asia that we're going to freeze all your assets. July 1941, August, September, October, November, December. That's 5 months before Pearl Harbor. So wow, in August we stopped selling oil. I know. You can see that this issue is very important to me. So the U.S. stopped selling oil 4 months before Pearl Harbor. The FDR, that FDR stands for Franklin Delano Roosevelt. That's the president. The president says, let's put some more aircraft carriers and battleships in Hawaii because it's halfway to Japan. And Japan really thought there was going to be a war anyway. A lot of leaders in Japan thought we're going to end up in a war with the United States anyway. So why don't we go attack Pearl Harbor and let's knock out as many of those battleships and aircraft carriers as we possibly can, because of one of two things. Either one, that'll help us win the war, or number two, if we ruin enough of the U.S. Navy in Pearl Harbor, maybe the United States will decide not to go to war with us because we'll have ruined their battleships and their aircraft carriers. And of course right there, Japan thought, okay, knock all that off, the U.S. won't be able to stop us. And then in November of 41, no diplomatic ties. We weren't talking to them. They weren't talking to us. So if I was going to sum all this up, like what would be my theme of these last two slides, I would say it like this. During the decade coming up towards Pearl Harbor, the country of Japan across Asia in order and put sanctions against the country of Japan. Japan figured, you know, there's going to be a war anyway. We're going to punch the United States off. And so they did. And I'm not trying to say this because I'm just justifying and saying, oh, Japan was right and the United States was wrong. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying it the opposite of that either. I'm saying that from the perspective of the leaders of Japan, what they did was okay. Just for fun, how many people have had World War II history in a class before today? Before today. So 3 or 4 people are willing, 5 at some point in your education, you've had World War II history. Have I brought up anything that y'all didn't know before? A little? Yeah, when I was in school, back in 1947, it was right after the war, and of course Japan was evil in 1947. And of course the winning side gets to write the history books. So there was no Japanese perspective taught to me when I was in high school. And that's probably one of those top lessons that one could learn as a human being. The other person always has a different perspective than you have. And so they're going to behave differently than you do. And the only way you're ever going to be able to come to terms and straighten things out without violence is to try to find out what is that other person's perspective. Not that you have to agree with it, but just that you can understand it. And that's today's life lesson. And that's all I have for today. Oh, does anybody have a draft of an essay they want to give me today so I can look at it tonight and give it back to you on Wednesday? I'll take that as well. Class is dismissed, no matter what.